in the quiet hush of night. When the world outside grows still, and soft shadows stretch across familiar walls, let us drift back through time to a place where fire, iron, and human hands came together to shape more than just tools. They shaped whole communities. Far from the grand empires that usually dominate history books, there were blacksmiths in small towns and villages of West Africa, whose quiet labor turned raw earth into objects of survival and beauty. Their forges glowed softly in the dark, sending sparks into the night sky, and their work, though often forgotten, carried a weight of invention that touched every corner of daily life. This is not a story of kings and conquerors, but of men and women who bent iron to their will, who whispered to fire, who crafted the unseen details of history. Their inventions did not always make it into scrolls or chronicles, yet they live on in the traces of metal, in the memory of hands that hammered and shaped, and in the lives that depended on their work. Tonight, we will let their story unfold slowly, like embers glowing gently, long after the fire has gone quiet. We will not rush, for history is never in a hurry. Instead, we will settle in and listen to the forgotten inventions of West African blacksmiths, carried on a breeze of time, softened for sleep, and ready to remind us how even the smallest sparks can light the longest nights. In the heart of West Africa, where the red earth baked under the sun and the silhouettes of towering baobab trees stood like ancient guardians, there was always the sound of hammers, not the loud, jarring crash of ironworks in great cities, but a softer rhythm, steady, patient, almost like the heartbeat of the land itself. The blacksmith's forge was never far from daily life, and though its glow was often hidden within mud brick walls, the faint smell of smoke and the hiss of cooling iron carried through every village. Here, the blacksmith was not simply a worker of metal. He was a keeper of knowledge, an inventor in his own quiet way. For in a world without written blueprints or laboratories, invention did not always appear in sudden bursts of discovery. Instead, it unfolded slowly, through repetition, through trial and error, through generations of hands passing down what the fire had taught them. The forge itself was a marvel. Bellows made from animal hides and wooden frames breathed life into the flames, giving the fire the strength to soften stubborn or into glowing, malleable iron. With each pull and release of the bellows, the coals brightened, sparks lifting into the air like stars caught in daylight. Children often watched with wide eyes from a safe distance, mesmerized by the shimmer of molten metal, while the elders nodded quietly, remembering how the same sight had captivated them in their youth. From this process came more than just weapons. Those spears and knives were indeed important. There were farming tools, iron hoes that sliced the earth more cleanly than stone, and sickles that curved like the crescent moon, making harvests swifter, easier, more abundant. There were cooking implements too, heavy iron pots that held the flavor of stews for hours, and spatulas that could withstand the hottest flames without bending. Some blacksmiths even fashioned adornments, bracelets and rings forged with care, polished until they shone in the firelight. These were not simply ornaments. They carried meaning, marking milestones in life or status within the community. What made these inventions so remarkable was not that they appeared suddenly, but that they were refined with care, shaped slowly over centuries. Each improvement carried forward like a secret, and yet, because no parchment recorded them, no historian marked them down, they remained fragile, surviving only in oral memory, in the persistence of craft, in the iron itself. In many villages, the blacksmith's role stretched far beyond his tools. He was considered a figure between worlds, one who touched both earth and fire, one who could command an element that others feared. The villagers often approached him, not only for plowshares and cooking pots, but for charms and amulets, small objects believed to carry protection, strength, or luck. For in shaping metal, he shaped also the unseen, weaving invention into belief, and craft into ritual. As The day faded, and dusk settled in. The forge remained warm. Sparks glowed faintly even after the bellows stilled, and the air carried a lingering warmth that seemed to seep into the night itself. Villagers passed by on their way home, casting brief glances toward the workshop. They did not linger long, for it was known that blacksmiths worked best in solitude, guided not by distraction, but by the rhythm of their own quiet knowledge. The forgotten inventions of these blacksmiths were not grand machines or towering monuments. They were small, enduring creations, humble in form, but vast in impact. And though they never reached the pages of history, they remained in the soil tilled by iron, in the meals cooked in sturdy pots, and in the protection carried by those who wore their amulets close to the skin. Like the embers beneath the baobab tree, these inventions glowed softly, unrecorded, uncelebrated, but never entirely extinguished. The slow, rhythmic heartbeat of blacksmithing in West Africa was not only found in the clang of iron, but also in the way tools and ideas traveled, along hidden paths. Blacksmiths were not merely village artisans, they were nodes in vast webs of cultural exchange, quiet keepers of secrets that had flowed from generation to generation. In dusty workshops, under roofs thatched with palm leaves, or beneath open skies where the evening air cooled the forge, their presence lingered like a steady drumbeat through history. What made these blacksmiths so extraordinary was not always the grandeur of their craft, but the subtle genius of their inventions, tools that rarely entered the chronicles of empires, yet shaped the survival of ordinary people. Their creations had a strange duality. They were both practical and spiritual, both earthly and transcendent. One of the forgotten practices among them was the delicate shaping of miniature iron amulets. These were not weapons, nor tools for farming, but tiny iron charms hammered with precision. Some bore spiraled patterns, others abstract forms that only the blacksmiths and elders could interpret. Travelers would hang them around their necks, farmers would bury them at the edges of fields, and mothers might sew them into the hems of children's garments. To outsiders, they looked like curious trinkets. To the communities who trusted them, they were protections woven from metal guardians forged in fire. Equally fascinating was the blacksmith's quiet role in water management. In lands where dry seasons stretched long, small metal instruments were fashioned to test the depth and purity of wells. Thin rods, hammered to extraordinary sharpness, would be lowered into earth or stone-lined shafts, clinking softly as they touched rock or struck water. These rods were also used in rituals of divination, whether the well would remain abundant, whether the rains would come. Such inventions blended practicality with belief, showing how science and spirituality could walk hand in hand in the daily lives of communities. Their agricultural contributions, too, reached beyond the obvious plow or hoe. Some smiths designed ingenious iron combs, long-toothed instruments, used not for hair, but for separating grains from chaff. These combs, when dragged slowly through harvested stalks, teased the grain loose with remarkable efficiency. The action required patience, but it transformed the labor of harvest, lightening the burden for families who worked beneath the relentless sun. There were also fishing inventions, little remembered today. In coastal villages and riverside towns, blacksmiths forged hooks of distinctive spiral design. These hooks, unlike straight European ones, twisted gently in a way that mirrored the natural curves of river reeds. Fish drawn to them were less likely to slip free, and local fishermen swore they were blessed with uncanny success when using them. To this day, echoes of these spiral hook traditions survive in certain communities, though their precise origins remain clouded in mystery. At night, when the fires of the forge dimmed and the village quieted, blacksmiths would sometimes sit with elders and recount the lineage of these tools, not as tales of invention, but as stories of survival. They spoke of how the rod for wells protected a village from thirst, how the spiral hook fed children, how the grain comb ensured winter stores. Each invention was remembered not in terms of innovation, but in terms of human need. And in that sense, they became less like objects and more like companions in the rhythm of daily life. What is most striking, perhaps, is how few of these devices ever entered the larger record of history. Unlike great swords or royal ornaments, they were not preserved in museums. They were worn down, broken, and replaced in the cycles of work. Their memory lingers not in grand displays, but in fragments: a rusted hook buried in river silt, a bent rod found in the dust of an abandoned well, a tiny amulet unearthed near the foundation of an old homestead. Quiet relics, whispering of forgotten blacksmiths whose genius hid in plain sight. The more one looks at the blacksmiths' role in West African history, the clearer it becomes that their work extended far beyond the shaping of tools or weapons. They were not merely craftsmen, but custodians of cultural continuity, quietly ensuring that traditions passed down from earlier generations remained alive within their workshops. When a blacksmith taught his apprentice the slow rhythm of hammering iron, he was not only passing on a trade, but also preserving a worldview, a way of engaging with materials, with the earth, and with the unseen spiritual forces believed to dwell within metal. This was particularly evident in the smithing traditions that arose around the great trade routes of the Sahel towns that sat on caravan roads. Leading from the goldfields of the south toward the markets of North Africa became thriving centers where blacksmiths found steady work. The constant arrival of merchants, travelers, and herders created a demand, not only for everyday items, but also for specialized tools to fit the diverse needs of passing peoples. One might imagine the smith's forge near a bustling market, its sparks flickering against the dusk as traders bartered over salt, hides, or kola nuts nearby. The blacksmith's forge itself held layers of symbolism. It was often located slightly apart from other dwellings, sometimes at the edge of the village, for the space was thought to be powerful and even a little dangerous. The act of coaxing fire, bellows, and molten metal into cooperation was understood as something akin to mediation between natural and supernatural forces. The steady pumping of the bellows was compared in some oral traditions to the breathing of a spirit, while the glowing furnace was likened to the belly of the earth itself. From these workshops emerged not only utilitarian items, hoes for agriculture, knives for daily tasks, or arrowheads for hunting, but also subtle innovations that rarely find mention in sweeping histories. For instance, blacksmiths in certain regions developed variations of interlocking iron joints used in building or transport, techniques that could strengthen wooden structures without nails. Others devised methods for creating small, flexible, iron chains that were used in harnessing animals or in fastening tools. Though simple by appearance, these innovations reveal a creative ingenuity, born out of necessity, that shaped the fabric of daily life. Equally fascinating was the way blacksmiths adapted their tools for local environments. In regions where the soil was sandy and less fertile, they modified hoes with wider blades to move loose earth efficiently. In wetter climates, they shaped them differently, narrowing the edges to cut into heavier ground. This quiet responsiveness to ecological variation shows the blacksmith's awareness not only of the properties of iron, but also of the land itself. In a sense, every tool carried within it a subtle map of its environment, forged into shape by the needs of those who would use it. Beyond tools, some blacksmiths crafted musical instruments that blended metal with wood, such as iron bells or percussive objects that were used in ceremonies and dances. These were not only instruments of sound, but also devices of communication, sometimes echoing messages across villages during festivals or rituals. Here too, the blacksmith stood at a boundary between silence and rhythm, between the earthbound and the ceremonial. The apprentices who grew up in these environments were steeped in layers of knowledge. They learned how to locate ore deposits, how to build clay furnaces capable of withstanding extreme heat, how to tend fire with patience, and how to listen for the subtle ring that told whether a tool was properly tempered. At the same time, They absorbed a set of social teachings: respect for secrecy, humility before the powers of the forge, and loyalty to the lineage of smiths who had come before them. In some communities, blacksmiths even played a role in dispute resolution. The authority they carried extended beyond their craft, and their ability to manipulate iron was often equated with a capacity for fairness and wisdom. A villager might come to the forge not only with a broken hoe to be repaired, but also with a quarrel to be judged. The smith's decision carried weight, for he was seen as one who had access to knowledge others did not. As the centuries moved forward, the forgotten inventions of these blacksmiths multiplied quietly. Some innovations vanished as circumstances changed: tools made redundant by shifting crops, iron fittings replaced by wood or fiber. Others lingered in use for generations, carried from village to village, slowly adapted into new forms. What unites them all is their invisibility in broader histories. The countless small adjustments, inventions, and ideas that never bore the name of their creator, but were simply absorbed into the flow of daily life. And so, when one pauses to imagine the blacksmith of West Africa in the late centuries before industrial machinery, it is less the image of a singular invention that emerges, and more that of a patient innovator, a figure whose creativity was expressed in hundreds of modest ways, each one responding to the specific needs of a community, each one leaving behind a faint but enduring trace. The blacksmiths' lives were not only defined by the clang of metal or the glow of firelight, but also by the rhythms of the communities that surrounded them. In villages across the regions of Mali, Ghana, and the wider Sahel, a forge was often placed near the outskirts of the settlement, where the heat and sparks would not disturb the clusters of thatched huts and granaries. The path leading to a blacksmith's workspace was typically well-worn, a trail pressed into the earth by countless footsteps, farmers bringing broken tools, hunters seeking spear repairs, and elders asking for ritual objects to be fashioned. These quiet comings and goings were as much a part of the smith's craft as the fire itself, for they reflected the unbroken dialogue between artisan and community. One easily forgotten invention of these craftsmen was not a weapon or plow, but a type of bell used in agricultural rituals and dance. Forged with a gentle flare at its mouth, the bell produced a deep, resonant tone that carried across fields during planting ceremonies. To the outsider, it may have seemed a simple percussion instrument, but for the villagers, its sound signaled the beginning of sowing season, the gathering of families, and the invocation of ancestral spirits to bless the soil. The bell was at once a tool, an invention, and a memory keeper, holding within its vibrations a reminder that work and worship were inseparable. Equally overlooked were the smith's designs for iron bracelets and anklets, often given to children as protective charms. These were not crude pieces, but carefully balanced rings, with slight variations in thickness that allowed for comfort when worn daily. Many such designs were accompanied by etchings, simple line work that told stories of rivers, trees, or constellations. Though small in size, these objects required the same mastery of heat, rhythm, and patience as any weapon. They reveal that invention was not always directed toward efficiency or conquest. Sometimes it was about weaving protection, beauty, and identity into everyday life. Another striking contribution was in the realm of agriculture. Long before imported ironware altered patterns of farming, blacksmiths in West Africa devised unique hoe blades with curved edges designed to move smoothly through sandy or semi-arid soils. Unlike the heavy European hoes that would later arrive, through trade, these locally made tools were lighter, allowing farmers to work for longer hours without excessive fatigue. They were often made with detachable wooden handles, so they could be replaced easily without discarding the iron head. In this, the smiths revealed a practical ingenuity. They understood not only the demands of the land, but also the daily endurance of the farmer who bent to it. The knowledge of airflow also became an inventive art. While most accounts focus on large bellows used to fuel the forge, some blacksmiths crafted smaller, portable bellows for use in tasks that required precision, such as the repair of delicate ornaments or the testing of metal before full shaping. These smaller devices, often built with animal hides stretched over carved wooden frames, may appear modest, yet they embodied a layered understanding of how to control fire on multiple scales. Without them, some of the finer details of craft, the subtle smoothing of edges, the tempering of smaller blades would have been far more difficult. The forge itself was an invention in constant adaptation. In some regions, smiths dug their furnaces directly into the ground, insulating them with clay to maintain steady heat. Elsewhere, raised furnaces were built with stone bases and narrow chimneys to guide the smoke upward, reducing irritation to the eyes while working. Each forge, though built with local materials, carried the same principle, a vessel in which stone could be transformed into something alive with use. Villagers often described the forge as having a spirit of its own, a breathing thing that lived alongside the smith. In remembering these quieter inventions, bells that sang to the fields, anklets that guarded children, hoes that honored the soil, bellows that whispered fire into life, we glimpse a world where innovation was not about fame or spectacle. It was about continuity, about ensuring that life could move forward with rhythm and grace. The blacksmith did not always leave behind towering monuments, but he left traces in the smallest details of daily life, the way a farmer's hand fit a handle, the way a child carried protection in metal around the wrist, the way a village danced to the sound of iron echoing through the night. These are the inventions we so often overlook because they do not survive in museums or history books. Yet in their time, they were as vital as any grand discovery. They remind us that history is not only made of battles and empires, it is also stitched together by the simple objects that shaped the ordinary days of countless lives. As we linger on the image of village forges, it is worth pausing to consider the quiet but profound rhythm of their surroundings. The West African landscape, with its broad savannas, dense groves, and winding rivers, shaped the very materials available to blacksmiths. Iron-bearing stone was not evenly distributed, and so entire communities developed intricate knowledge of where to mine, how to transport, and how to preserve their precious raw materials. Small paths, worn into the earth little more than lines, traced by countless footsteps, led from river valleys to furnace pits, and from shaded hillsides down to settlements where sparks would glow after dusk. One could almost imagine the patient footsteps of apprentices carrying baskets of ore on their heads, the sound of their sandals crunching dry soil, and the distant beating of drums from neighboring villages marking the rhythm of the day. Blacksmithing, in this world, was not simply a craft. It was woven into ritual, into story, into the very framework of identity. The act of striking hot iron on an anvil was, for many, a symbolic echo of creation itself. Oral traditions preserved across centuries often described the first blacksmiths as descendants of mythical beings, entrusted with the dangerous gift of fire. The hammer became not only a tool, but a symbol, something that could shape both earth's raw offerings and the fortunes of those who wielded them. To outsiders, the blacksmith's courtyard may have appeared ordinary, but to those within the culture, it was a place of balance, where human skill and natural forces met in delicate harmony. One of the lesser remembered but fascinating aspects of West African blacksmithing was the careful attention paid to air. Bellows, fashioned from wood and animal hide, were not crude improvisations, but carefully engineered devices designed to deliver consistent, controlled breaths into the heart of the furnace. The rhythm of these bellows often followed the pulse of human hands and feet, creating a meditative tempo that resonated through the forge. Each exhale of air into the flames did more than heat the metal, it carried with it an awareness of timing, patience, and discipline. Some apprentices spent years mastering only the art of the bellows, for an erratic stream of air could ruin a batch of iron, while a steady one could coax metal into perfect malleability. Equally important were the fuels used. Charcoal, made from carefully selected woods, was not chosen at random. Blacksmiths knew which trees produced the longest-lasting heat, which gave off minimal smoke, and which left behind ash that could later be mixed into other practical compounds. In this way, the forge extended far beyond the hammer, and the anvil. It became a network of ecological knowledge. The blacksmith had to understand the forest, the soil, the winds, and the subtle behavior of fire itself. A forge, therefore, was a living intersection of disciplines: metallurgy, ecology, ritual, and artistry. When speaking of forgotten inventions, we often think of tangible tools or clever devices, but one might also consider the intangible systems these artisans developed. Take, for instance, their ingenious methods of organizing labor. Many blacksmiths worked within guild-like family lineages, where knowledge was handed down through tightly guarded secrets. These groups created unwritten but effective systems of apprenticeship, resource sharing, and even dispute resolution. In many communities, blacksmiths acted as mediators. Their authority derived not from political power, but from the quiet respect afforded to those who tamed fire. The very structure of their working lives could be seen as an invention in itself, an innovation in how knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations without the written word. Perhaps one of the most captivating yet understated innovations was the subtle shaping of agricultural tools. While grand weapons and ornate objects often capture our modern imagination, it was the hoe, the plow attachment, and the simple iron blade that transformed daily life. These were not glamorous items, yet their design required careful balance, light enough to wield, strong enough to endure seasons of use, sharp enough to make cultivation efficient. In each of these implements, one can see the mind of the blacksmith solving problems quietly, responding to the rhythms of farming life, and ensuring that communities could survive drought, grow surplus food, and sustain trade. These tools, often forgotten in grand historical narratives, were inventions no less significant than monumental machines elsewhere in the world. In the cool evenings, when the forge had gone silent and the embers dimmed, the tools and creations would remain laid out neatly on mats, or leaning against wooden beams. Their simple forms belied the knowledge locked within them. To the blacksmith, each piece carried a story of the ore that had been dug with sweat, of the fire that had been coaxed patiently, and of the countless strikes that had shaped it into being. To us, centuries later, these objects may seem ordinary, but in their quiet persistence they reveal something far greater. An entire world of invention and ingenuity that flourished outside the written record, surviving only in fragments of memory and the rhythms of tradition. Beyond the flicker of glowing embers and the rhythmic sound of hammer on anvil, the story of West African blacksmiths also unfolded in their quiet but ingenious responses to the simple needs of everyday life. One of the most fascinating, yet often overlooked aspects of their craft was their ability to create small, practical devices that served not only as tools of work, but as tools of comfort. These were not grand machines meant to change the course of kingdoms, but humble inventions that gently shaped how daily existence was lived in villages, markets, and homes. Take, for example, the matter of food preparation. Long before imported metal pots and pans became common in the region, local blacksmiths devised iron cooking stands with adjustable heights. These stands were simple tripods or frames, yet their construction allowed a clay pot to be suspended securely above a fire at just the right level. By sliding or adjusting the pot stand, families could control the heat with surprising precision, ensuring rice would not burn too quickly, or that a rich peanut stew could simmer slowly through the afternoon. These were not flamboyant inventions, and yet they carried a quiet intelligence and understanding of the delicate balance between flame, pot, and meal. Many of these stands have disappeared, buried in the soil of abandoned compounds, their importance remembered only faintly in oral traditions. Blacksmiths also fashioned ingenious forms of portable lamps and fire holders. in villages where night fell without the comfort of glass-covered lanterns. These craftsmen built small iron cradles that could hold glowing coals. Families carried them from room to room, and traders on long roads balanced them carefully to provide warmth during travel. Unlike wooden torches, which burned quickly and messily, these coal holders allowed for slow, steady light and heat, their embers glowing for hours into the night. Such designs may appear simple, yet they represent the ingenuity of minds who understood the needs of ordinary life and worked metal into forms that answered them. Equally inventive were the blacksmiths' contributions to farming beyond the obvious plows and hoes. Among their lesser-known creations were small, curved iron teeth fixed to wooden rakes, which allowed farmers to gather sheaves of grain more efficiently. These were not the sweeping scythes of Europe, but modest tools adapted perfectly to the crops and soils of West Africa. Some smiths even experimented with multi-purpose blades, knives shaped in such a way that they could both cut through brush and split open cola nuts, saving farmers and traders the need to carry several tools at once. Such multi-purpose ingenuity was a hallmark of their craft. Efficiency achieved not by extravagance, but by careful attention to the rhythms of daily labor. There were also quieter, almost hidden inventions, such as iron hooks for storage in houses where grain, dried fish, or cloth needed to be suspended from rafters to keep them safe from pests. Blacksmiths produced small but sturdy hooks that could be embedded into beams. These hooks, though unremarkable at first glance, changed the way food and materials were preserved. They lifted essential goods above the reach of animals, insects, and damp ground. In some households, the number and strength of these hooks reflected the prosperity of the family, though few outsiders would have recognized their importance. The artistry of these blacksmiths extended even into the social and spiritual lives of their communities. They designed musical instruments that were more than just carriers of sound. They were tools for memory, rhythm, and ceremony. Iron bells, crafted in twin forms to produce alternating tones, became indispensable in dances, rituals, and festivals. These were not loud instruments like drums, but their sharp, resonant tones cut through the air with clarity, guiding the rhythm of gatherings. The very shape of the bells, sometimes curved, sometimes elongated, represented a kind of experimentation with sound, an early form of acoustic engineering, born not in formal schools, but in the steady observation of how metal vibrated when struck. Equally fascinating are the forgotten locks and fastening systems blacksmiths devised. In regions where storage granaries or family compounds needed to be secured, smiths built sliding bolts and latch mechanisms out of iron, often decorated with subtle engravings. These locks were not the complex tumblers of later centuries, but they offered security and privacy in ways that wooden fastenings could not. Archaeologists who have uncovered fragments of these locks often find them rusted and bent, their mechanisms frozen with time, yet they tell of a period when innovation was directed at protecting not just kingdoms, but the humble possessions of families. Even the ritual world benefited from their practical imagination. In some traditions, smiths created small iron staffs with branching ends that were planted into the ground during ceremonies. These staffs held symbolic meaning, but they were also functional, serving as places where offerings could be tied, or where cloth could be draped during important events. Such inventions remind us that in West Africa, the line between utility and symbolism was often blurred. An object could be both a tool and a sacred emblem. As one reflects on these forgotten inventions, a pattern emerges. Blacksmiths were never limited to producing weapons or heavy agricultural tools alone. Their hands shaped the very texture of daily living. They devised ways to cook more evenly, store food more safely, light the darkness more efficiently, and secure possessions more reliably. Their genius lay not in grand spectacles, but in the quiet recognition of life's small difficulties and in the ability to forge metal solutions that endured through generations. It is easy, in hindsight, to overlook these contributions, to dismiss them as minor or ordinary. But if one imagines living in a village centuries ago, the importance of such inventions becomes clearer. A secure lock might mean the difference between hunger and plenty. A portable coal lamp might mean the possibility of traveling at night. A simple pot stand might determine whether food nourished or burned. In these quiet ways, the blacksmith's inventions shaped not just the physical landscape, but the rhythms of family, trade, and community. And so, as Section 1 continues to unfold, we begin to see the blacksmith not merely as a craftsman of tools for survival, but as an inventor in his own right, an artisan whose forgotten creations remind us that innovation does not always come wrapped in spectacle, but often in the subtle bending of iron to serve the needs of daily life. Beyond the forge itself, the life of the blacksmith in West African societies was threaded deeply into ritual, symbolism, and the very rhythms of village existence. To speak of these artisans only in terms of hammers and iron would be to leave their story half told. Their workshops, often situated slightly apart from the central compounds, were not simply places of labor, but spaces infused with meaning, where earth, fire, air, and human skill combined in a slow dance of transformation. A visitor to one of these workshops in centuries past might have first noticed the ground beneath their feet hardened earth, darkened from years of charcoal dust and metal filings. The air would carry not only the acrid scent of smoke, but also the faint sweetness of resinous woods burned to achieve certain heat levels. Wooden bellows, sometimes shaped with leather skins, stood like patient creatures waiting to be pressed, their rhythmic sighs feeding fire with life. Children of the blacksmith's family, or apprentices from nearby clans, might have been tasked with keeping the fire alive, pumping steadily, learning patience long before they learned precision. The work of the blacksmith began long before the hammer struck metal, or had to be gathered from the earth, sometimes from riverbeds, sometimes from rocky outcrops that revealed their iron-rich veins only to those who had been taught how to recognize them. This gathering itself carried ritual weight, for the act of removing metal from the earth was not merely extraction, but a negotiation with forces believed to reside beneath the soil. Some blacksmiths were known to pour libations, or recite words of respect before digging, acknowledging that the earth was giving up part of itself. The ore would then be broken down, mixed with charcoal, and arranged in carefully constructed clay furnaces. These furnaces, rising from the ground like rounded towers, bore the marks of countless repairs and refinements, small cracks, sealed with fresh clay, surfaces blackened by years of fire. When the furnaces roared to life, they did more than melt, or they stitched the human and the elemental into one endeavor. Heat and time combined to yield a bloom of metal that, once extracted, looked nothing like the shining iron of a finished tool. It was raw, porous, reluctant material, demanding the blacksmith's full patience to coax it into usefulness. The long process of hammering, folding, and heating did not simply strengthen the metal, it symbolized transformation. A rough substance becoming something durable, purposeful, and in many ways, alive. The tools that emerged from these workshops were not only blades or hoes, they were silent companions of daily life. Slender needles for stitching leather, delicate tips for repairing fishing nets, and small awls that allowed craftsmen of other trades to shape wood or weave fibers with precision. Each piece bore the touch of its maker's subtle variations, in the curve of a blade or the thickness of a handle that revealed the habits of the hand that shaped it. For the farmer in the fields, the warrior on the path, or the weaver in the shade, these objects extended their reach and softened their labors. Yet the blacksmith's importance extended far beyond utility. In many West African traditions, these artisans were regarded with a mixture of reverence and caution. Their ability to manipulate fire and metal placed them in a liminal category, neither entirely of the ordinary world, nor completely removed from it. Oral traditions often describe them as keepers of secret knowledge, individuals who understood the hidden conversations between matter and spirit. Because of this, blacksmiths were sometimes entrusted with roles that extended into healing, divination, or dispute settlement, their words carrying weight, even outside the forge. In moments of community life, festivals, initiations, or ceremonies of harvest, the blacksmith's presence could be felt, even if not always seen. Masks and ritual objects carved from wood often bore iron embellishments forged in their workshops. Spears used in ceremonial dances might gleam with metal tips shaped days earlier over the anvil. Even musical instruments, such as iron gongs or rattles, carried the sound of the forge into gatherings, their tones reminding listeners of fire, rhythm, and continuity. To live as a blacksmith was to live at the intersection of the practical and the symbolic. The day's labor may have been focused on a single blade or a set of farming tools, but woven into that task was a lineage of inherited knowledge and spiritual significance. Apprenticeship was not simply a technical training but a gradual initiation into ways of seeing the world, an education in patience, discipline, and the belief that matter itself carried both burden and blessing. As we imagine these workshops scattered across towns and villages, we begin to see how the story of West African blacksmiths is not confined to the spectacular weapons or ornaments sometimes highlighted in historical accounts. It is equally present in the quiet shaping of everyday life, in the rhythms of hammer and bellows that accompanied dawn and dusk, in the unseen hands that forged the small, sturdy companions of human existence. These forgotten useful and enduring form the foundation upon which so much else was built. When we think of West African blacksmiths, it is easy to imagine only the hammer striking the anvil, sparks flying in the dim light of a workshop. Yet their world was far more layered, far more textured, and quietly inventive in ways that modern history often overlooks. These were not simply men who shaped metal into tools. They were designers of systems, quiet engineers of daily life, and keepers of an evolving body of knowledge that was as much spiritual as it was practical. One of the most intriguing, though little discussed, aspects of their craft was their ability to devise new tools for agricultural efficiency, which, to the outside observer, may have appeared ordinary, but in reality were unique adaptations shaped by generations of observation. For example, in regions where soils shifted between wet and dry seasons, blacksmiths developed specialized hoes with subtly curved blades. These curves were not decorative, but carefully calculated, allowing the farmer to dig into hardened earth at the start of the dry season and later sweep aside softer, moist soil when the rains returned. Such adjustments might seem small, yet they represented a deep awareness of environment and understanding that survival depended on harmony with shifting climates. Equally fascinating were the blacksmiths' experiments with metallurgy itself. Unlike European traditions that prized uniformity, West African blacksmiths often blended metals with organic substances during smelting. Oral histories speak of powders made from certain roots or ground bones, cast into the fire at just the right moment, while modern metallurgists may dismiss these additions as symbolic or ritualistic. There are hints that they also subtly affected the properties of the metal, changing its hardness, its resistance to rust, or even its resonance when struck. A plow that sang with a clearer tone as it struck the earth was not simply pleasing to the ear. It was also a sign of quality, a subtle marker that the metal had been fused with care. Beyond agriculture, forgotten inventions emerged in the realm of daily domestic life. Blacksmiths crafted compact iron cooking stands that allowed pots to be placed above small fires with surprising stability. These simple designs, light enough to be carried, sturdy enough to last decades, freed households from relying solely on stone or clay arrangements. In villages where wood was scarce, such inventions meant that fuel could be used more efficiently. Though humble, these portable stoves may well be considered an early form of energy-saving technology. Some blacksmiths even designed mechanisms for community use, like simple locking systems for granaries. Using interlocking iron pins, they created ways to secure food storage from animals or even from thieves during lean seasons. These locks were often so cleverly disguised that they looked like nothing more than decorative fittings. To the untrained eye, a grain store might appear entirely unguarded, when in fact it was secured by a system known only to its maker and the family that owned it. Here again, we see how invention blended seamlessly with tradition, practical utility hidden beneath ornament. The symbolic dimension of invention must also be remembered. West African blacksmiths often shaped miniature tools, charms, or figurines that were not used in the field or the household, but carried in pockets, worn on belts, or offered at shrines. Some were believed to protect the wearer from accidents in the hunt, others to ensure that a traveler would find food and water along the way. These charms might seem small and personal, yet they reveal a broader truth. Invention was not confined to the visible and functional. It also extended to the unseen realm, where protection, luck, and blessing were considered just as vital as the sharpness of a blade or the balance of a hoe. Trade added another layer of complexity. In bustling marketplaces along the Niger or the Gambia, blacksmiths often sold not only finished tools but also semi-processed iron bars. These bars, standardized in length and weight, could function as a kind of currency. This practice meant that blacksmiths were not only inventors of tools, but also participants in an economic system that blurred the line between money and material. The fact that iron could be both a resource for future invention and a medium of exchange speaks to the depth of their role in community life. Even the blacksmiths' workshops themselves contained quiet inventions. Simple bellows, made from animal skins and wooden frames, were refined over time into highly efficient systems capable of sustaining long, steady airflow. The rhythm of these bellows, pushed and pulled by apprentices or younger relatives, formed the heartbeat of the forge. Some designs incorporated dual chambers, allowing one side to fill while the other expelled air, creating a nearly continuous stream. This refinement meant hotter fires, faster smelting, and the possibility of crafting more complex objects. It was invention, hidden in plain sight, embedded in the very process of creation. As we linger on these images, it becomes clear that the history of West African blacksmiths is not one of dramatic leaps or singular discoveries. Rather, it is a history of countless subtle adjustments, each shaped by environment, necessity, and imagination. Their forgotten inventions were not displayed in museums, nor written into scientific treatises, but lived on in the hands of farmers, cooks, hunters, and traders. Theirs was an innovation woven into daily rhythm, where usefulness and symbolism intertwined until neither could be separated. And so, when we pause to reflect on this world, we realize that invention itself need not always be loud, nor always recorded in grand chronicles. Sometimes, invention is quiet, born of observation, carried by memory, and folded into the fabric of community life. As the rhythms of daily life among West African blacksmiths become clearer, one begins to sense that the story so far has merely set the stage. The hammering in the forge, the patient tending of fires, and the exchanges between masters and apprentices are not ends in themselves, but preludes to a wider narrative. Each clang of iron against anvil was not just labor, but the spark of possibility. Every tool that emerged from the glow of the hearth hinted at an underlying ingenuity, sometimes practical, sometimes experimental, and often forgotten with the passing of centuries. It is here, in the steady hum of these workshops, that we must pause. The blacksmith's world was never still, never static. Fires were stoked not only to repair plows or shape spears, but also to test new ideas, to refine techniques, to answer challenges posed by changing times. In these transitions, from one generation to the next, something remarkable occurred. The birth of inventions that did not always survive in the annals of history. Some were modest, never traveling beyond a handful of villages. Others were bold, taking root across kingdoms before quietly vanishing. A few were so ordinary in appearance that later historians overlooked them entirely, forgetting that what seemed simple in retrospect was once astonishing in its novelty. To recover these inventions now requires patience, listening not only to archaeology and oral memory, but also to the faint echoes left in ritual, in proverb, in the designs carved into tools that no longer serve their original purpose. Thus, as we move forward, our story shifts. We will leave behind, for a time, the general picture of the smith at work and focus more closely on the creations themselves, the forgotten inventions that once shaped daily life in subtle but enduring ways. From ingenious farming tools that reshaped harvests, to experimental smelting methods that altered the strength of iron, to designs that spoke as much to symbolism as to function. These innovations wait quietly to be remembered. And so, the path opens into the next stage of our journey, Section 2, where the blacksmith's ingenuity comes into clearer light, and where we begin to trace the outlines of those forgotten inventions that once carried meaning, pride, and practicality in West African life. If one were to wander through a West African village centuries ago, the inventions of the blacksmith would not have announced themselves with grand ceremony. They were not displayed as treasures, nor inscribed into stone. Instead, they existed, quietly in the cadence of life woven into harvest, travel, ritual, and even into the way people measured time. Many of these inventions were so seamlessly integrated into daily rhythms that they seemed to belong to nature itself. And because of that, history rarely paused to notice them. Consider, for instance, the humble agricultural hoe. At first glance, it was a simple object, forged from a flat blade and bound to a wooden shaft. Yet the blacksmith's variations on this tool were nothing short of ingenious. Some blades were widened for soft, fertile soils. Others were narrowed to cut through clay or packed earth. Certain villages carried hoes with distinctive curves, designed to loosen ground without exhausting the wrist. These small adjustments transformed the rhythm of farming, allowing fields to be worked more efficiently and with less strain on the body. While no chronicles praised these modifications, their value was felt in every harvest that fed a household, every surplus that supported a market, every season in which the soil yielded just enough to sustain a community. Beyond the fields, another invention lay in the design of iron-tipped digging sticks. These were not ornamental, but highly practical, used to pierce the ground for planting yams or cassava, crops central to West African sustenance. Unlike their wooden counterparts, which splintered easily, these iron-tipped sticks endured season after season. Some even bore decorative etchings, as though the smith wished to remind the farmer that endurance itself could be beautiful. In these etchings lingered a kind of duality, a tool that served immediate needs while carrying quiet artistry, a reminder that invention was never just about survival, but also about expression. Equally significant were innovations in transportation. It is easy to forget that before large-scale roads and cart systems, people moved across landscapes on foot or with simple carriers. Blacksmiths forged iron fittings for saddles, harnesses, and pack gear that allowed donkeys and horses to bear loads across difficult terrain. Without such refinements, trade caravans, those long lines of people moving salt, cola nuts, or textiles across regions, would have been far more arduous. Though these small iron pieces rarely survive in museum collections, they were the unseen infrastructure of commerce, inventions that stitched together distant economies. Even the shaping of household life bore the touch of forgotten smithly invention. Iron cooking tripods, for instance, became fixtures in kitchens, holding pots above flames at just the right height for simmering. Before their widespread use, families relied on balancing pots directly on stones or embers, a precarious and inefficient method. With the tripod, cooking became steadier, more predictable, and safer. Children could gather near the hearth without fear of collapsing pots, and meals could be prepared with a patience that deepened family rituals around food. No chronicler thought to record the arrival of the iron tripod, but it was an invention that reshaped how people shared nourishment. The blacksmith's inventive hand extended, too, into ritual and the unseen world. In many communities, smiths designed iron objects used exclusively for ceremonies, staffs, bells, and intricate emblems that represented authority, protection, or connection to ancestors. Some of these were practical in origin: bells for signaling gatherings, staffs for marking boundaries, but their reimagining in symbolic form blurred the line between invention and sacred creation. In this sense, the smith did not only forge objects, but also redefined their meaning, showing how a simple tool could transform into a vessel of spiritual weight. One of the most striking aspects of these inventions is how they traveled. Ideas did not remain locked within one forge or village. They passed from hand to hand, carried in caravans, adopted by neighboring peoples, reshaped in new contexts. A farming tool devised in one region might, generations later, appear in another, altered slightly to suit different soils or crops. This silent diffusion of invention was rarely remarked upon, but it testifies to the blacksmith's role as not merely a craftsman, but as a quiet engineer of cultural continuity. Yet, because these objects were common, they disappeared from memory once they broke or were replaced. Unlike monumental architecture or royal regalia, everyday inventions were rarely preserved. They were used, worn down, discarded, and forgotten. What remains are hints-oral accounts of tools once praised for their usefulness, fragments unearthed in soil, and the faint memory of designs that no longer serve their original purpose. It is precisely this ordinariness that makes them so extraordinary. These inventions remind us that history is not only written in the great battles or royal decrees, but also in the shape of a hoe, the balance of a cooking stand, the curve of an iron tip. They are the kind of details that quietly carried whole societies forward, leaving little trace except for the lives they sustained. As we uncover them, one by one, we see the blacksmith's ingenuity for what it truly was, a form of creativity that thrived in the practical, the durable, and the useful. And it is in this understated brilliance that the true spirit of their forgotten inventions resides. As one considers the spread of blacksmithing traditions across the savannas and river valleys of West Africa, it becomes evident that these craftsmen were not confined to a single community or cultural center. Rather, they formed a vast and interconnected network, with techniques, designs, and symbolic meanings traveling slowly along trade paths. These roots worn into the earth by generations of travelers connected farming villages to bustling market towns, and market towns to distant kingdoms. Alongside kola nuts, salt, and cloth, the tools and inventions of blacksmiths moved as well, subtly shaping the lives of people who might never know the names of the men who forged them. The role of itinerant smiths was especially notable. Some men traveled from one village to the next, carrying only their most essential hammers, chisels, and a few carefully guarded secrets of their craft. They would set up temporary forges wherever they were welcomed, working in exchange for grain, goats, or a place to sleep. These traveling smiths became vessels of innovation, spreading ideas from one community to another. A new design for a hoe blade might emerge in a riverside town and, within a few seasons, appear in the fields of distant farmers hundreds of miles away. The spread was gradual, almost invisible, yet it shaped the agricultural landscape of the entire region. Beyond tools, smiths also fashioned objects that embodied deeper meanings. Certain iron staffs or figurines were not meant for daily labor, but for rituals that spoke to the rhythms of life and death, planting and harvest, war and peace. These artifacts served as a reminder that blacksmithing was never merely about shaping useful implements. It was also about shaping the invisible bonds between people, their ancestors, and the unseen world. Oral traditions tell us of iron amulets that were believed to carry protective powers, or iron rings hammered into sacred trees that anchored communities to the spiritual landscape. In this way, the smith's influence extended well beyond the boundaries of the forge. He was not simply a worker of metal, but a participant in the great cycles of time and society. A wedding might involve iron bracelets forged to mark the joining of families. A funeral might include iron bells that rang to accompany the spirit into the afterlife. In these moments, the craft of the blacksmith was interwoven with the most intimate experiences of human existence. Equally fascinating is the way in which blacksmiths balanced secrecy and sharing. Some techniques were closely guarded, taught only within certain lineages or guilds. Apprenticeship often began at a young age, with boys spending years simply learning to fan the bellows or strike sparks before they were trusted with the actual shaping of iron. These secrets created a sense of exclusivity and continuity, ensuring that the craft retained its power and prestige. Yet at the same time, necessity demanded that certain inventions be shared. A better designed plow, after all, could feed more mouths, and communities often benefited when knowledge spread beyond the narrow walls of secrecy. The gradual blending of innovation and tradition can still be glimpsed in the archaeological record. Excavations across West Africa have uncovered fragments of furnaces, slag, and iron tools dating back centuries. The surviving pieces may appear ordinary at first glance: rusted hoes, corroded knives, or broken spear tips, but they speak to a world where human ingenuity was exercised daily in ways both practical and profound. Each object carries within it the memory of countless hours of labor, the rhythm of hammer strikes echoing across open landscapes, and the quiet pride of craftsmen who shaped their communities without ever writing their names into history. What emerges, then, is not the story of isolated achievements, but of a collective and ongoing tradition. The forgotten inventions of West African blacksmiths were not celebrated with monuments or carved into stone chronicles, yet they endured in the daily routines of farmers, hunters, and families. To study them is to glimpse a history that is quieter, less dramatic, but no less vital, a history carried, not by kings or conquerors, but by the steady hands of men who bent fire and metal to the needs of their people. As the rhythm of the blacksmith's hammer shaped not only iron, but the very fabric of West African daily life. The role of invention in these workshops extended beyond mere tools. What often goes unnoticed is how blacksmiths devised methods for managing heat and fire itself, methods that were in many ways as significant as the tools they produced. Controlling fire was not a passive act. It was a sophisticated art of balancing air, fuel, and timing. By experimenting with airflow, smiths created bellows of differing sizes, some designed to be operated by hand, and others constructed in such a way that a person could use their feet while keeping their hands free for delicate work. This innovation allowed for longer sessions at the forge without exhausting the smith, and it also permitted greater precision in reaching the exact temperatures needed for smelting and shaping. The forgotten detail lies in how such modifications to bellows altered the rhythm of entire workshops, introducing a cadence of movement that could be maintained for hours at a time, almost like a ritual of breath and fire that sustained the village. What followed naturally from this control over fire was experimentation with layering materials. Archaeological studies of ancient smithing sites in Mali and Senegal have revealed fragments of iron mixed with traces of copper, and even hints of glassy residues. While not all of these experiments succeeded, they tell us that blacksmiths were attempting to alter the properties of metals through processes akin to early alloys. Some of these attempts produced tougher edges for farming tools, while others created decorative finishes that gleamed differently in sunlight, giving rise to objects that were both functional and symbolic. These were not inventions written down or standardized, but instead lived in the memory of a craftsperson, past 2 apprentices in whispered instructions, in the angle of a hand, or in the timing of a blow. In this way, invention was not a sudden spark, but a slow accumulation of gestures, repeated across generations. Alongside these metallurgical advances came subtler but equally important innovations in workshop organization. Blacksmiths began to devise storage systems for their tools, shaping wooden racks, clay-lined pits, and stone benches where chisels, tongs, and hammers could be kept in order. While at first glance this may seem mundane, such organizational systems allowed smiths to move with speed and efficiency, responding quickly to the demands of a customer waiting for a repaired hoe or a newly forged knife. The efficiency itself was a form of invention, a way of saving time, reducing wasted effort, and ensuring that apprentices could find what they needed without disturbing the master's rhythm. In this sense, the workshop was not just a place of noise and heat, but a carefully structured space where every object had its place. The social side of invention also deserves attention. In many West African communities, smiths were responsible for creating musical instruments alongside their farming and hunting tools. The forging of iron bells, used in ceremonies and festivals, demonstrates how the craft reached into the heart of communal life. Some blacksmiths experimented with the shape and thickness of these bells to produce varying tones, effectively designing instruments through trial and error. The resulting sounds became markers of cultural identity, each region recognizing the resonance of its own smith's work. In this sense, forgotten inventions included not only practical items but also auditory landscape stones and rhythms born from metal that echoed through rituals, dances, and celebrations. Equally fascinating is the way blacksmiths innovated in response to their natural environment. In areas where wood for charcoal was scarce, smiths sought alternative fuels. Some turned to dried grasses, animal dung, or carefully prepared mixtures of plant matter that could burn long enough to sustain a forge. Others experimented with clay furnaces of different shapes, adjusting airflow in ways that reduced fuel consumption while maintaining high heat. These ecological adaptations were themselves inventions, though they rarely appear in written records. They remind us that creativity is not always about producing a new object, but also about refining the conditions under which creation itself can take place. Through these layered innovations, bellows that breathed like lungs, alloys that shimmered with unexpected colors, organized workshops that functioned like well-practiced performances, instruments that carried sound into ceremony, and furnaces adapted to the rhythms of the land, we begin to see the blacksmith not merely as a maker of tools, but as an inventor in the truest sense. Each forgotten detail adds to a larger picture of ingenuity, rooted in patience, necessity, and the constant dance with fire. Beyond the day-to-day production of tools and weapons, blacksmiths in many West African communities were also thought to possess a certain mastery over time itself, not in the mystical sense of bending the hours, but in their ability to pace labor, to regulate the rhythms of village life, and to dictate the speed at which things progressed. A festival could not begin until the blacksmiths had struck the ceremonial gong. A hunt might not proceed until they had finished the repair of spears or arrowheads. Even farming cycles sometimes followed the completion of tools by the forge. In this way, the smith's work shaped not only the material environment, but the temporal flow of daily life, guiding when communities planted, harvested, or went to war. This sense of rhythm extended into their apprenticeships as well. Young learners, often chosen from families with close ties to the smith, spent years observing, before ever lifting a hammer. They swept the forge, gathered wood for charcoal, and pumped the bellows for endless hours. In the repetitive action of feeding air into glowing coals, they absorbed the sounds and cycles of the trade. Only after demonstrating patience were they permitted to shape a nail or repair a hinge. These small steps prepared them for the more sophisticated work of forging tools with layered iron, sometimes inlaid with decorative etchings or bronze rivets. It was a slow unfolding of skill, and in its slowness lay the secret to durability. What often goes unmentioned in wider histories is the inventive variety of smaller household items crafted by these artisans. While weapons and agricultural tools dominate the imagination, many smiths were quietly experimenting with objects designed for domestic convenience. Simple iron cooking tripods, folding fire tongs, and portable braziers made life easier in ways that rarely drew notice from outside. Chroniclers. Some families in Senegambia possessed specialized ladles, or skewers, fashioned with elegant spiral handles, which kept hands cool, even when placed over an open flame. Others had collapsible iron frames to support water jars, making them easier to carry without spillage. These were not monumental inventions, but their usefulness was profound, embedded in the unspoken details of daily living. Equally striking was the blacksmith's ability to adapt imported ideas into their own traditions. With the slow trickle of foreign trade along desert caravan routes or through coastal contact, small fragments of ironwork from beyond West Africa occasionally arrived, hinges from North Africa, buckles from Europe, or even fine copper trinkets from the Middle East. Rather than simply imitating these designs, blacksmiths integrated them into local aesthetics. A Moroccan hinge might be reimagined as part of a granary door, etched with geometric designs drawn from local textile patterns. A European buckle could inspire a series of intricate fasteners for horse harnesses, made sturdier and more practical than the original. In this way, inventions traveled not as mere copies but as seeds, transformed by the blacksmith's hand into something entirely new. The spiritual dimension of these artisanship practices deepened their cultural importance. In many villages, blacksmiths were seen as custodians of hidden knowledge, intermediaries between the physical and unseen worlds. Their ability to transform raw earth into iron was perceived almost as alchemy, a proof that they had access to powers unavailable to ordinary men. Rituals accompanied the first forging of each season, often with libations poured, songs sung, and prayers whispered into the flames. It was not simply work, it was a dialogue with forces larger than the smith himself. Forgotten today are the subtle rituals, such as sprinkling ground cola nut into the forge for protection, or the way apprentices whispered invocations before attempting their first strike. Each detail reflected a worldview where invention, religion, and survival were inseparably linked. One particularly overlooked invention, noted only faintly in a handful of oral accounts, was a kind of early locking mechanism used for granaries and storage houses. Unlike the metal locks of Europe or Asia, these were hybrid designs, wooden frameworks, reinforced with forged iron pins and simple sliding bolts. The ingenuity lay not in their complexity, but in their adaptability. Farmers could secure their harvests against both pests and theft, while the design itself could be easily repaired using local tools. Such devices may not have survived in abundance, but their echoes can still be glimpsed in some traditional compounds where iron brackets and bolts are fused with carved wood, reminders of this subtle innovation. As the blacksmith's role expanded, so too did the symbolism of their tools. The hammer and tongs, for example, were not merely instruments of labor, but emblems of authority. In some regions, chiefs received miniature replicas of smithing tools during coronation ceremonies, signifying their dependence on the hidden power of the forge. Even the bellows, humble though they seemed, were imbued with meaning. They symbolized the breath of life, the invisible force that kept the fire burning. Such associations reveal how deeply the inventions of blacksmiths seeped into the broader cultural imagination, shaping not only what people used, but how they thought about creation, power, and endurance. These forgotten details, apprentices patiently learning through repetition, families cooking with iron utensils shaped to their needs, farmers securing their crops with ingenious locks, rulers drawing strength from smithing emblems together, reveal that the story of West African blacksmithing was never only about warfare or agriculture, It was about invention as an everyday rhythm, about tools that quietly shaped existence, about a craft that blended the physical and the spiritual in ways both subtle and profound. As the generations passed, the role of the blacksmith expanded, beyond the purely practical and into the symbolic. In several West African societies, particularly in the savanna regions, the blacksmith was not only a craftsman, but a figure touched with an almost mystical aura. It was said that to work with fire and iron was to stand between worlds, the earth that yielded ore, and the unseen spirits that governed transformation. This perception gave rise to an environment in which invention was not simply the result of necessity, but of ritual, observation, and a willingness to experiment with the very essence of nature itself. Among the quiet legacies of these smiths were innovations in smelting techniques that, though rarely written about, marked significant advancements in the control of heat and airflow. Archaeological traces suggest that some furnaces incorporated subtle adjustments, angled air vents, layered clay linings, and carefully measured charcoal mixtures that allowed for steadier combustion. Such refinements seem small when viewed from the perspective of industrial modernity, yet in their time, they represented centuries of cumulative learning. A blacksmith might have noticed that a particular clay hardened less under intense heat, or that goatskin bellows produced a steadier draft than reed ones. These minute discoveries, passed from teacher to apprentice, quietly shaped the path of metallurgy in the region. The objects created from these processes carried not only functionality, but also artistry. Iron hoes and plow tips were sometimes engraved with shallow patterns, not elaborate, but rhythmic lines and curves that echoed the designs found in textiles and pottery. It was as if the blacksmiths believed that even tools for breaking earth should reflect a sense of harmony. Some blades bore decorative ridges that caught the light, while spearheads might carry subtle etchings intended to strengthen the owner's sense of belonging or courage. These designs reveal that invention was rarely limited to form alone, embraced beauty as much as utility. Equally fascinating were the quiet experiments with alloys. While European histories often emphasize the introduction of bronze and steel as grand milestones, West African smiths were also blending and tempering metals in their own right, albeit with a different rhythm of discovery. Some villages developed methods of mixing iron with trace amounts of other materials, perhaps by accident, perhaps by careful repetition, producing tools with a resilience that puzzled outsiders who first encountered them. Even the act of quenching, plunging a red-hot blade into water or oil, was carried out with ritual precision, and variations in the process hinted at localized forms of invention. One particularly overlooked contribution of these blacksmiths lay in the realm of household implements. Beyond weaponry and agriculture, they fashioned iron hooks for hanging pots, cleverly jointed hinges for wooden doors, and delicate needles that enabled finer stitching of leather goods. A smith might produce miniature tongs for gripping coals, or small chisels for woodworking. These were quiet revolutions in daily life, innovations that made cooking, building, and craftwork just a little easier. Yet because they were humble objects, they rarely entered the sweeping accounts of explorers or chroniclers. Instead, they remained part of the intimate history of homes and hearths. The blacksmith's workshop itself can also be considered a kind of invention. These were spaces organized, with deliberate attention to rhythm and repetition. The placement of the anvil, the proximity of the bellows, the arrangement of tools on wooden racks all reflected a working knowledge of ergonomics long before the term existed. Apprentices were trained not only in the act of striking iron but in the pattern of movement within the space, ensuring that heat, force, and breath all flowed together. The forge was thus both a laboratory and a stage, where invention unfolded through practice as much as through inspiration. Stories passed down through oral tradition add yet another layer. Some tell of blacksmiths who discovered new tools through dreams, awakening with visions of curved blades or unusual joints that they later tried to replicate in metal. Others speak of smiths whose patience in watching the sparks and listening to the hiss of cooling iron led them to adjustments in timing that changed the quality of their work. Whether these tales are historical fact or myth is almost beside the point. They remind us that invention was understood not only as technical progress, but as a dialogue between the seen and unseen, between human hands and natural forces. In all these ways, forgotten inventions of West African blacksmiths revealed themselves not as isolated breakthroughs, but as an ongoing tapestry of trial, error, refinement, and meaning. They were innovations woven into daily rhythms, into farming, cooking, building, and protecting communities. To trace them now is to slow our pace, to notice the small adjustments that accumulate into transformation. And as we move further into this history, we begin to see how such overlooked contributions quietly shaped the fabric of life across centuries. The story of West African blacksmithing, however, cannot be told only in terms of tools and weapons. One must also consider the rhythm of daily life, the way in which iron quietly became part of the cultural fabric. To imagine this, picture the small villages scattered across the savannah, each with its own blacksmith's hut, often placed slightly apart from the main cluster of homes. The decision to situate the forge on the edge of the community was not arbitrary. It reflected a mix of reverence and caution. The forge was seen as a sacred, yet dangerous place, a site where the ordinary rules of daily life did not always apply. The blacksmith handled fire and ore, shaping Earth's raw matter into useful forms, and this act placed him in a liminal category, neither fully ordinary nor fully mystical, but straddling both worlds at once. Travelers who journeyed across regions often remarked on the curious hum of these villages. At dawn, the air would be filled with birdsong and the calls of herders leading animals to pasture. But by mid-morning, the sharp, rhythmic clang of hammer striking metal would rise above the sounds of the day. Each village had its own distinctive cadence, a pattern that was both work and art. Children would sometimes mimic these sounds in their play, tapping stones together in imitation of the forge. The blacksmith's work thus became a kind of background music to communal life, steady and reliable. A reminder that tools were being shaped even as people went about their daily routines. Beyond their utility, many objects produced by blacksmiths carried layered meanings. A simple hoe might symbolize sustenance, but in certain contexts it also represented renewal, the turning of soil and the hope of future harvests. Spears and blades, though associated with conflict, were not solely instruments of violence. They were often crafted with motifs or markings that linked them to ancestral spirits or protective charms. These inscriptions, subtle to the eye, were believed to imbue the weapon with a certain spiritual resilience. Thus, the blacksmith was not only fashioning implements for labor or defense, but also embedding in them an unseen network of cultural beliefs. The marketplace offered another glimpse into the role of these craftsmen. On trade days, villagers and travelers gathered at designated clearings, spreading mats upon the ground to display wares. Among baskets of grain, cloth dyed in indigo, and pottery fired in clay ovens, one could often find rows of gleaming iron tools, their surfaces catching the sunlight. A farmer might negotiate for a new sickle, running a thumb carefully along its edge, while a trader from another region might admire a set of small knives, noting how the craftsmanship differed subtly from what he had seen in his homeland. These exchanges were not merely commercial, they were conversations across cultures. Every object carried with it a story, where the ore had been mined, how the fire had been tended, what ancestral techniques had been honored in its shaping. In this way, the blacksmith's work moved beyond his village, quietly entering the broader networks of exchange that tied distant communities together. Equally fascinating is how blacksmiths navigated their dual identity as both artisans and keepers of knowledge. While their work was highly practical, the process was veiled in ritual. Many blacksmiths observed taboos, or codes of conduct, before beginning a major task. Some might fast, others recite invocations to ensure that the iron would take shape smoothly. These practices were not simply superstition. They reflected an understanding that the work of forging could not be separated from the unseen dimensions of existence. The transformation of raw ore into shining metal seemed too powerful an act to be left entirely to chance. It demanded respect for forces beyond the visible. Generational continuity also shaped the craft. A young apprentice did not merely learn how to swing a hammer or manage the heat of a furnace. He absorbed the slower lessons of patience, observation, and humility. Apprentices often began with menial tasks, stoking fires, carrying water, or sweeping the forge. Only after long observation would they be permitted to handle tools, and even then, their work was closely watched. The knowledge passed down was not just technical, it was also ethical, instilling in the apprentice a sense of responsibility toward his community. To misuse one's skill, to fashion weapons irresponsibly, or to betray the trust of the village, was seen as a grave failing. And yet, within these expectations, there was also room for quiet creativity. Some blacksmiths developed unique styles, recognizable by the curvature of a blade or the decoration on a handle. These flourishes, while subtle, marked the individuality of the smith. They were never flamboyant, but carried an understated pride, a signature that fellow craftsmen or discerning villagers could recognize. In this way, blacksmithing in West Africa blended tradition and innovation, each generation bound to the past but also nudging the craft forward in small, measured steps. What emerges from this picture is a reminder that the so-called forgotten inventions of these blacksmiths were never forgotten in their own time. They were woven into the rhythms of labor, belief, and exchange, forming the quiet backbone of daily survival. A home might not seem as dramatic as a monumental building or a dazzling artifact of gold. Yet in its own way, it carried as much significance. It was an invention of necessity, a tool that allowed fields to yield crops, families to eat, and communities to thrive. And so, the legacy of the blacksmith rests not in rare treasures, but in the unbroken line of usefulness. In the simple endurance of iron that outlasted season after season. As the story of Section 2 continues, one begins to see that blacksmiths were not only craftsmen, but also guardians of balance, balancing the visible with the invisible, the practical with the spiritual, the past with the present. Their inventions may appear modest at first glance, yet they speak to a way of life where every tool had meaning, and every act of forging was a small dialogue between human hands and the larger world of nature and spirit. The work of the blacksmith was not confined to the forge itself, for the rhythms of their labor extended outward into the surrounding community in ways both subtle and profound. Every strike of the hammer carried with it not only the shaping of iron but also the shaping of relationships between villages, between families, and between generations. To understand this, one must picture the steady pulse of a smithy as something akin to the heartbeat of the town, long before the sound of drums signaled a gathering or a message. The measured clang of the anvil was already setting a cadence that echoed through daily life. Children, too young to be allowed inside the smithy, would mimic those sounds outside by tapping sticks on stones, instinctively imitating the rhythm that defined their elders' work. The forging of tools did not end with hoes or knives. Blacksmiths also became innovators of less obvious, yet essential, instruments. Consider the small iron rings that fastened woven baskets or strengthened the edges of leather pouches. To the casual observer, these were unremarkable objects, mere fasteners or trimmings, but within them was embedded a mastery of proportion and tensile strength. The smiths had long understood that iron, when worked thin and looped carefully, could bind together what even the strongest fibers might eventually fail to hold. These subtle inventions seldom found mention in epic tales. Yet they allowed families to carry heavier harvests, travel with sturdier packs, and store grain in ways that preserved it longer against the damp and the insects. Even more fascinating were the smiths' contributions to musical instruments. Though they are remembered primarily for hoes and spears, many smiths crafted the iron tongues of lamellophones, musical instruments such as the mbiera and its West African counterparts. To produce a note that was clear and resonant, the smith had to balance thickness and flexibility, sometimes testing dozens of thin iron strips before finding the one that rang with the right timbre. In this way, the blacksmith stood at the intersection of industry and art, enabling music that carried across ceremonies, markets, and quiet evening gatherings. The same hands that fashioned tools for harvest and war also gave shape to instruments that soothed children to sleep or summoned whole villages to dance. Nor should one overlook the blacksmith's ingenuity in repairing and repurposing broken metal. Scraps of discarded iron rarely went to waste. They were reforged, reshaped, or melted into new forms. A bent blade might become a plowshare, while a cracked spearhead could be reforged into smaller tools. This practice of conservation, born of necessity, reveals a sophisticated awareness of resources. Iron ore was not infinite, and the labor required to smelt it was immense. Thus, recycling was not merely an afterthought, but a central element of their craft. Some scholars today might describe this as an early form of sustainable industry, though to the blacksmiths it was simply common sense. The smith's skills also extended into the realm of ritual and medicine, where iron objects were imbued with symbolic meaning. In certain communities, small iron charms were worn as amulets, believed to guard against illness or misfortune. These charms might take the form of miniature hoes, knives, or abstract shapes hammered into iron discs. Whether or not one believed in their protective powers, the existence of such objects demonstrates the breadth of the smith's influence. Their creations were present not only in the field and the home, but also in the intimate spaces of spiritual life. To hold such an amulet was to carry a fragment of the forge's fire close to the body, a token of both human craft and divine mystery. As the centuries passed, the techniques of West African blacksmiths adapted to changing circumstances. Trade brought new demands. Horses, for instance, required iron bits, stirrups, and horseshoes in some regions, while the introduction of certain crops shifted the design of hoes and sickles. The smiths responded with characteristic flexibility, innovating new forms while preserving the essential rhythm of their work, even when foreign iron bars arrived through trade, often bearing marks of distant smelters. Local smiths reshaped them according to the needs and knowledge of their own communities. This interplay of external influence and internal tradition added new layers of complexity to their craft. In thinking about these forgotten inventions, the iron rings, the musical tongues, the charms, the recycled scraps, we begin to see that the history of blacksmithing is not one of grand monuments, but of countless small solutions. These solutions, while humble, accumulated into a vast architecture of daily survival. They made possible the storage of food, the repair of tools, the spread of music, and the belief in protection against unseen forces. And it is perhaps in these quiet contributions, rather than in the gleam of weaponry or the roar of furnaces, that the true legacy of the blacksmith lies. The story of the West African blacksmith cannot remain contained within the narrow lanes of the village or the shaded courtyards where their forges glowed red against the night. To understand the full breadth of their contribution, we must step outward into the winding trade routes, the rivers that carried goods and stories alike, and the vast landscapes where caravans stretched like moving villages across the horizon. By the time ironworking had become firmly established, West Africa was already alive with patterns of exchange. Salt, cola, nuts, gold, ivory, and cloth moved across long distances, linking diverse communities in relationships of trade and trust. Into this rich tapestry, The blacksmith's products entered almost seamlessly. A hoe might travel beside sacks of grain. A finely made knife might lie tucked within a bale of cloth. A small iron ornament could be carried as a token of friendship, or an object of barter. Each piece, though small in itself, carried the memory of the fire, the hammer, and the steady rhythm of craft along the great Niger River. For instance, one can imagine boats gliding downstream, their cargo carefully balanced. Among baskets of dried fish and folded mats, iron tools would find a place, valued by those waiting at distant markets. These river journeys were not swift affairs. They took time, measured in days and weeks, as traders paused at small landing sites where villagers gathered to barter. At each stop, the work of the blacksmith spread further, leaving behind the quiet impression of invention. Caravans that crossed the Sahel carried these iron goods even farther, moving slowly under the glare of the sun. With camels burdened by both necessities and luxuries, traders made their way toward towns that hummed with activity. Timbuktu, Jengao, cities that would become famed for their scholars and merchants, were also places where blacksmith-made items shifted hands. A sword forged in one settlement might find itself displayed in the armory of a warrior many miles away. An iron lock, simple in design, might secure a storeroom in a town that had never seen the blacksmith who made it. Yet what is perhaps most striking is that blacksmiths themselves sometimes joined these networks, moving with caravans as valued artisans. A journeying blacksmith could establish a temporary forge in a roadside camp, setting up bellows and tools under the open sky. There, as travelers rested, he might repair a spear, fix a broken chain, or fashion a small knife in exchange for food, cloth, or a place within the caravan. His skills were portable in a way that few others were, for wherever there was fire and stone, iron could be coaxed into new shapes. These wider connections also gave rise to innovation. Exposure to distant styles of weaponry, farming methods, or decorative motifs often spurred blacksmiths to adapt their own work. A blade scene in the possession of a northern merchant might inspire a local variant. A hinge used in a caravan chest might be reimagined for a village granary. Thus, invention was not a solitary act, but a dialogue carried out across miles of savanna and forest, mediated by the hands of countless smiths. It is worth pausing here to consider the rhythms of this exchange. Unlike the rapid movement of goods in modern markets, the pace was slow, almost contemplative. A single iron tool might take weeks to reach its destination. Its value was not diminished by the time it took. Rather, the journey added layers of meaning. Every transaction involved not only barter, but conversation. Traders sharing news of distant lands, villagers listening with curiosity, blacksmiths noting what was desired beyond their own communities. Through such exchanges, knowledge spread, in quiet ripples, unseen yet enduring. And so, as we drift deeper into this story, we begin to see that the work of the blacksmith was never static. It traveled, it adapted, it inspired. In the next part of this section, we will explore more closely how these traveling inventions shaped both the economic and symbolic life of West Africa, influencing everything from the wealth of kingdoms to the rituals of everyday households. The story of blacksmithing in West Africa cannot be fully understood without pausing to consider the deeply symbolic relationship between fire, metal, and ritual practice. While earlier parts have shown us the technical side of smelting and forging, Section 3 allows us to wander deeper into the cultural meanings that surrounded these workshops. For they were more than places of labor, they were thresholds between the seen and unseen, between the earthly and the divine. Many villages treated the act of smelting as a sacred drama, unfolding in slow, measured movements. The furnace itself was often regarded as a womb, a vessel of transformation, where raw ore was reborn as usable iron. In some regions, women were not permitted to witness the smelting process, not because their presence was unwanted, but because Their creative power was considered too closely aligned with the transformative power of the furnace. To combine the two was thought to risk imbalance, as though the forces of birth and rebirth might clash if not carefully managed. This belief gave the smelter's role a uniquely charged place in the community. When smelters began their work, the sounds of the bellows filled the air like a heartbeat. Villagers listening nearby might describe the rhythm as though the earth itself were breathing. The heat that rose from the glowing furnace reminded them of the sun's strength, compressed into a single point. Sparks leaped upward into the night sky, and those sparks were sometimes interpreted as messages or signs, an unspoken dialogue between the smiths and the spirit world. This ritualized perception also extended to the timing of smelting. Certain days were favored, particularly those aligned with lunar cycles or agricultural milestones. If the season had brought plentiful rains and the fields were green with millet, it was believed the ore would be cooperative, melting more cleanly. If, however, drought or famine shadowed the land, the iron was said to resist, as though mirroring the mood of the environment. These associations made the blacksmith not only a worker of metal, but also an interpreter of the earth's temperament. Beyond smelting, forging itself carried ritual weight. A hammer striking against heated metal was likened to thunder, a sound that echoed across valleys and villages, reminding listeners of storms, fertility, and power. Children often paused in their play when the hammer rang, for they were taught that the rhythm of forging echoed the language of the ancestors. It was said that to listen closely to a smith at work was to overhear fragments of wisdom too ancient to be put into ordinary words. These beliefs meant that smiths were not only craftsmen but also custodians of balance. In many societies, they served as mediators in disputes, healers of spiritual imbalance, and advisors in moments of uncertainty. Their tools were not simply practical, but symbolic. The hammer, a sign of strength; the anvil, a foundation of stability; the tongs, a symbol of control. Even the smallest objects in the forge carried layered meanings, and villagers would sometimes seek blessings by touching or offering gifts to these implements. The tools they produced were likewise imbued with spiritual meaning. An iron hoe was not merely a farming implement, it was an agreement between humans and the earth, a pact that promised nourishment in exchange for care. A blade was not simply a weapon, but a guardian object, often wrapped in leather or adorned with charms to bind its power to the hands of its owner. Jewelry made from iron, though less common than gold or bronze, carried immense protective symbolism, thought to shield its wearer from illness, misfortune, or hostile forces. As we drift through these accounts, we begin to see how invention and imagination were tightly woven together. What might appear to modern eyes as simple ritual was, for these communities, a framework for understanding the mysteries of transformation. The iron itself seemed alive, capable of responding to moods, climates, and intentions. To shape it was to engage in a conversation, not to impose dominance. In this way, forgotten inventions of West African blacksmiths included not only the physical tools and devices they created, but also the invisible structures of belief that gave those tools meaning. Without such cultural scaffolding, a hoe was only a hoe. But within this world, it became part of a larger cycle of growth, sustenance, and gratitude. And as we let these images settle in the mind, it is almost possible to hear the echo of a forge in the distance, the steady breath of the bellows rising and falling, the sparks leaping upward like fleeting constellations, and the slow, deliberate rhythm of hammer on iron, an ancient lullaby sung in metal and fire. If one lingers a little longer among the imagined workshops of these West African blacksmiths, the picture becomes richer still. The forges were not silent places, nor were they chaotic. They held a rhythm of their own, a slow, steady tempo shaped by the iron bellows, the soft hissing of heated metal plunged into water, and the muffled conversations that drifted between apprentices and masters. These sounds were not only practical but reassuring, a gentle background chorus that marked the passing of time in villages, where seasons mattered more than hours, and where a day's labor was measured, not by the ticking of clocks, but by the glowing hue of a finished tool or blade. Among the quieter but equally important inventions were the small devices designed for the careful preparation of food. Blacksmiths, for instance, created iron skewers with flattened edges, meant to hold strips of fish or meat securely as they cooked over the hearth. In other cases, they fashioned long-handled ladles, their bowls hammered thin yet sturdy, for stirring stews in large clay pots. Though modest, these utensils carried the fingerprints of invention as surely as any weapon. They transformed cooking, from a precarious balancing of wood and clay into something slightly more refined, allowing for better control of heat and the safer handling of food. It was in these details that the quiet ingenuity of the blacksmith revealed itself. There was also, scattered across the region, a small but curious tradition of musical experimentation. Blacksmiths, after all, were artisans of vibration and resonance, for every hammer strike upon metal carried with it a tone. Some took note of these tonal qualities and bent their skill toward instruments. Early iron bells were perhaps the most widespread, often cast or hammered in pairs, each tuned to a different pitch. These bells were not only ceremonial, but practical, used to mark the pacing of agricultural work, or to summon gatherings. A shepherd in a distant field might hear the deep note of a village bell, and know that the day's tasks were shifting. In time, other musical shapes emerged, rattles made of forged frames filled with pebbles, or thin strips of iron bent into arcs that, when struck, gave off a ringing clarity. It is easy to imagine that such objects were among the first to blur the line between tool and instrument, a reminder that invention often arises not only from necessity but from a desire for harmony, rhythm, and beauty within daily life. Another layer of forgotten invention lay in the blacksmith's role as an early engineer of mobility. Long before roads of stone or wheel carriages were common in many areas, people traveled on foot or by animal, bearing loads on their backs. Yet blacksmiths began to design simple iron fittings that improved these methods. Harness pieces, iron loops, and sturdy hooks allowed animals such as donkeys or horses to carry heavier burdens with less strain. A padded yoke, fastened with iron nails and rings, meant that an animal could haul goods more steadily. It is unlikely that these were seen as inventions at the time. They were mere adjustments, practical tweaks to daily equipment, but they collectively reshaped patterns of movement and trade. What is especially notable is that these innovations were rarely documented in writing. They lived instead in memory, in the hands of apprentices who observed their elders at work, in the objects themselves. A spoon passed down through generations, its surface polished by use, carried as much history as a grand ceremonial sword. A simple iron hook affixed to a wooden cart might never have been celebrated in song or carved into stone, yet it represented the sort of quiet engineering that allowed daily life to function smoothly. In this way, blacksmiths stood not only as creators of objects, but as preservers of small comforts, unseen yet essential. One might also pause to reflect on the ritual dimension of these inventions. In many villages, the act of forging a new tool was accompanied by a simple gesture, a drop of water poured upon the earth, or a short chant spoken before the forge. These rituals acknowledged the deep relationship between human effort and natural force. When an axe head was made, it was not merely a lump of iron shaped to cut wood. It was an offering of balance between earth, fire, and hand. Such symbolic weight added a layer of dignity even to the humblest of implements. The gradual unfolding of these details suggests that the work of blacksmiths was never confined to singular acts of creation. It was a continuum, stretching across generations, each addition built quietly upon the last. Tools, utensils, musical devices, fittings for animals, all were linked by an unspoken philosophy that no improvement was too small and no adjustment unworthy of attention. In the forgotten corners of West African history, these refinements existed like scattered embers, glowing faintly, overlooked but never extinguished. And so, as Section 3 deepens, one begins to sense the slow weaving of invention into the broader social fabric. These innovations were not only about solving immediate problems, but about binding communities together through shared rhythms of work, food, travel, and ceremony. The forge, then, was as much a place of connection as of craft, where the smallest spark could ripple outward into daily life in ways that we can only faintly glimpse today. Beyond the tools of war and the implements of farming, West African blacksmiths also concerned themselves with the quieter needs of daily life, the kinds of inventions that rarely appeared in chronicles or epic songs, but which shaped the rhythms of households and villages. In this sense, they were not only masters of fire and iron, but also quiet architects of comfort and subtle innovation. One such invention was the iron oil lamp, a simple yet ingenious adaptation that improved the ways in which people could gather after sunset. The lamp was often a shallow iron dish, sometimes with a delicately forged handle or a stand hammered from a single rod of metal. Into this dish was poured palm oil or shea butter, substances abundant in the region. A small piece of cotton fiber or dried grass served as the wick, compared to the softer glow of torches made from wood and resin. These lamps produced a steadier, cleaner flame, ideal for households or gatherings where storytelling and recitation were central. By offering longer-lasting light, the lamps allowed griots to extend their sessions, weaving histories deep into the night, and gave artisans extra hours to finish delicate work by hand. Though such an object seems ordinary, its subtle improvement of daily life reflected the blacksmith's ability to recognize the small refinements that sustained a community. Similarly, blacksmiths created iron cooking tripods, sturdy frames on which clay pots could be balanced above an open fire. Prior to these, pots were often wedged into earth or balanced on carefully arranged stones. The tripod offered not only greater stability, but also allowed fire to circulate more evenly beneath the vessel. Some tripods were plain, while others displayed surprising elegant slender legs, flaring outward like roots, or engraved with patterns that mimicked leaves and vines. This was practical art, meant not for courts or palaces, but for kitchens, where food simmered slowly, and where generations passed down recipes. In the faint glow of firelight, these tripods were silent companions to countless meals, their iron frames gradually blackened by soot, but enduring across decades of use. Another overlooked innovation was the crafting of iron musical tools, not the large ceremonial instruments that demanded attention in festivals, but smaller implements used in daily rhythm. One example was the handheld iron bell, or gong, often struck with a stick of wood. Unlike the hollow gourds or rattles used for lighter sound, iron bells produced a sharp, clear tone that could cut across distance. Farmers used them to signal one another across fields, while small groups in villages incorporated them into the steady pulse of working songs. These bells also had spiritual dimensions. In certain communities, they were considered voices of ancestors, each strike of iron echoing across the boundary of the visible and invisible world. Thus, in their modest size, they contained profound significance. Iron also entered into the realm of healing and medicine. Blacksmiths, often associated with mystical knowledge, sometimes forged small iron amulets or rings believed to protect wearers from illness or misfortune. Some rings bore no decoration at all, their plainness thought to be part of their strength, while others were incised with faint markings. Healers combined these objects with herbal remedies, believing that the durability of iron complemented the ephemeral nature of plants. While modern observers might call this superstition, it reveals an inventive blending of materials and beliefs, where iron was not only functional, but symbolic a way to bind body, spirit, and community together, beyond individual households. Blacksmiths also played a role in shaping infrastructure. In regions where water management was critical, they devised iron-bladed tools for digging and channeling streams, ensuring irrigation for crops during dry months. Though these tools were simple broad-headed hoes, pointed digging rods that allowed entire villages to reshape their landscapes. Without fanfare, these implements served as quiet inventions of survival, marrying iron to earth in ways that sustained agriculture and, by extension, life itself. The ingenuity extended further into the realm of transport and trade. While blacksmiths did not forge the large canoes that carried goods along the Niger or Senegal rivers, they provided essential fittings, iron nails, clamps, and hooks that strengthened the vessels. Some blacksmiths even crafted rudimentary iron anchors, heavy but functional, ensuring that traders could secure their boats against the pull of currents. In markets, they made simple iron weights for measuring goods, their sizes standardized by tradition and careful negotiation. In this way, blacksmiths became custodians of fairness, their craft underpinning the trust that allowed trade to flourish. Perhaps one of the most fascinating but little remembered inventions was the iron stylus used for inscribing on wooden tablets or softer materials coated in clay. While written traditions in West Africa were often preserved through Arabic script, on parchment, or through oral recitation, there existed a quieter layer of inscription practices. Traders and scholars, particularly in towns where learning was esteemed, used iron-tipped tools to make temporary notes, mark transactions, or guide students in lessons. These tools, though fragile and easily lost, represent the blacksmith's contribution to the intellectual as well as the practical life of the region. In these ways, the work of the blacksmith extended into corners of existence that outsiders might overlook. A lamp burning in the dark, a tripod holding steady, a simmering stew, a bell marking rhythm in the field, a ring clasped on the finger of a healer, or a stylus guiding the hand of a student all were inventions of quiet genius. None altered the trajectory of empires or reshaped the grand narratives of kings, yet all shaped the slow pulse of ordinary lives. And as we move deeper into this exploration, it becomes clear that the true brilliance of West African blacksmiths was not only in the weapons they forged or the prestige they commanded, but in their ability to notice what was needed, to bend iron toward the humble and the human, and to leave behind artifacts that, though often forgotten, still whisper their importance across the centuries. As we leave behind the dim forges, the soft rhythm of hammers, and the glow of embers in forgotten villages, we carry with us more than just the memory of blacksmiths at work. We carry the quiet heartbeat of a world where even the simplest invention, an iron hoe, a patterned blade, a humble lock, was once a miracle. The story of these artisans fades gently, like smoke rising into a night sky, dispersing into the silence of history. Their tools remain buried, their names often lost, but their legacy is hidden in every field once tilled, every market once bustling, every song once sung beside the steady spark of the forge. Perhaps, as you close your eyes, you might imagine those embers glowing faintly still, somewhere in the vast landscape of time waiting to be rediscovered. The work of these blacksmiths does not end. It only rests, like the earth itself resting, at night. And so, our journey into their world finds its pause here. Sleep now, as they once did after long days at the anvil, with the hum of iron and the warmth of fire drifting into dreams. Tomorrow, we will wander again into another corner of forgotten history. But for now, let the night carry you gently into rest.